right, good evening, everyone. It is 6 o'clock and I will call the 12th regular Common Council meeting to order for September 19th. Will the clerk please state the quote of the day?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Ability is what you're capable of doing. Motivation determines what you do. Attitude determines how well you do it.
All right, will the clerk please call the roll?
Alderperson Ackley.
Here.
Alderperson Decker.
Here.
Alderperson Feldy.
Here.
Alderperson Filicki-Pineski.
Here.
Alderperson Heidemann.
Here.
Alderperson Mitchell.
Here.
Alderperson Perella.
Here.
Alderperson Ramey.
Here.
Alderperson Rust.
Here.
Alderperson Salazar.
Here.
There are 10 present.
All right, it's good to have everyone here this evening. For those in attendance, if you're able, can you please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance?
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right, first order of business is approval of the minutes from our previous meeting. Alder Feldy?
Thank you, Mayor. I move to approve the minutes from the 11th regular council meeting held on September 6, 2022.
Second.
Motion second. Any discussion on the minutes? Seeing none, all those in favor of approving the minutes, please state aye.
Aye.
Any objection? Minutes are approved. Next is confirmation of mayoral appointments. City Attorney.
The mayor has submitted the following appointments for your confirmation. Jessica Huss to be considered for appointment to the Room Tax Commission. Alder Joe Heidemann to be considered for appointment to the Public Works Committee. Alder Zach Rust to be appointed as Vice Chair of the Public Works Committee.
Thank you. Alder Feldy?
I move to confirm.
Second.
There's been a motion and second. Any discussion? Seeing none, this is a roll call vote. Please refer to your Muni code.
Mine isn't working.
Mine's not working.
One says working. Let's try one more time. Okay.
Did you try unplugging it and plugging it back in?
Does anybody else got it?
I voted on something, I don't know what it was.
Oh,
It says voting is not open.
okay.
Oh.
Let's do it the manual way. Alderperson Ackley.
Aye.
Alderperson Decker.
Aye.
Alderperson Feldy.
Aye.
Alderperson Filicki-Pineski.
Aye.
Alderperson Heidemann. Alderperson Mitchell. Alderperson Perella. Alderperson Rust. Alderperson Salazar.
Aye.
10 ayes.
All right, that's approved. Anyone for public forum tonight?
No one this evening.
All right. Next, we have an election for the Board of Water Commissioners. Alder Feldy?
Thank you, Mayor. Sorry. I move that nominations be received from the floor, voting to be done by open ballot, and if two or more candidates are nominated, the candidate with the lowest number of votes be dropped from the list, and balloting will continue until the candidate receives a majority.
Is there a second?
Second.
There's been a motion and second. Are there any nominations? Alder Feldy?
Yes, I would like to nominate Gerald Vandekreek.
All right, is there a second?
Second.
Motion and second. Jerry, do you accept? Yes. All right. Are there any other nominations? Are there any other nominations? Final call, are there any other nominations? Is there a motion to close nominations?
So moved.
Is there a second? Second. Been a motion and second. Alder Feldy?
I move that the city clerk be instructed to cast a unanimous ballot for Gerald Vandekreek as a representative on Sheboygan Board of Water Commissions.
Second.
There's been a motion and second. This is a voice vote. All those in favor, please state aye.
Aye.
Any objection? All right, congratulations, Jerry. You're back on the board. And I'll just make a comment. Jerry's been doing a wonderful job on the Board of Water Commissioners for just a few years. So, yeah. Thank you, Jerry.
That's a long time.
All right, next we have our friends from Ehlers, which will be doing a financial management plan.
Well, that's not going to fit there. Okay, that will be on camera then. Sorry about that. Thank you very much. I'm David Ferris from Ehlers, here to present, I believe, the last piece of at least the general government version of the financial management plan. This is about the operating portion. Do you have something that's on screen, Todd, for this? Okay. I didn't want to get ahead of myself here. So, yeah, because hard copy if you want to write some notes and ask me some questions after, right? So if you want to go to the next page, this will be the table of contents basically of what we're going to do today. We're going to talk a little bit about how we have the model set up, some of the goals. We'll go through the bond rating, some of the information that goes along with getting rated. We'll talk about the operating fund projection. We'll do a little bit more of a deep dive on levy limits and expenditure restraint programs, since that's something that you're going to have to deal with here at budget time pretty soon. And then we'll show you with the combination of the capital plan and the operating plan what the property tax forecast looks like for the next 5 years. Then we just have some comments at the end that kind of talks about some of the things we saw and some things that you may consider in the future if you do have levy limit issues that you need to deal with. So going on to the next page. So this really is a graphical version of what the financial management plan is about. We kind of start with the city's CIP, which fuels the capital projects fund. The information you get from the general fund budget, the transit, the library, parks, and debt service kind of show what you need for tax levy needs. That funnels into a forecast that we do that is something I'll show you tonight as well. We already showed you the forecast for the CIP when we were here, but this adds to it the operating portion. We use equalized value when we're determining the levy rate, and the reason that we use market value, basically the taxable property in the city, is because it gives us comparability year after year. If we use the assessed value, which varies based on the fact that if you don't do a reassessment every year, a lot of times that value sits at the same value that it was assessed at, while the equalized value continues to grow. And as you maybe heard about this year, your net new construction, went up quite, or your equalized value went up quite a bit because housing values have jumped so much, and there's a really large increase just based on economic value change. And so when your house goes up that much, and you decide that you're going to try to keep your tax levy rate the same, it ends up taxing your people more. So it's something that we have to watch, that we're not taking advantage of growth that's related to economics as opposed to where we want the growth, which would be net new construction. So that's something that I'll talk a little bit more about when we get to the tax levy part, because it's pretty important that you know that you're actually spreading the taxes instead of just piling on top of your existing resident. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Out of the tax levy forecast and rate forecast, we'll talk about levy limits, we'll talk about fund balance, and we'll also talk about the expenditure restraint program. So going on to the next page, which is the goals of the plan. Usually a lot of times when we do this presentation, we're doing the whole thing. So we're doing the operating, we're doing the capital, and we're doing the TIFs, but you would have been here for probably more than you wanted to listen to me for. So we split those up just to kind of give you a little bits and pieces and have you hear things without such a big time commitment. But the goals of the plan in total is basically to provide you with estimate of future tax levy requirements and associated tax rate based on some assumptions that we use when we're doing this. Staff does chime in on some of the assumptions when we're doing the operating as well as the capital, and so those go into this model. We want this model to basically be yours. We want it to have it be support to your political decisions. We want you to use this as something that kind of guides you going forward and makes sure that you're heading down a path that puts the city in good financial standing. So we'll want you to, even though we're sitting here telling you a bunch of stuff, we want you to take ownership of this when once we get done and you've heard everything and we put it into a report. It's something that we want you to refer back to and basically know that, certain decisions could change how you go forward. The other thing is that it helps you identify potential financial pressure points. And when I say that, one of the things that we'll go over tonight is levy limits. And levy limits, the way that we have it modeled out, tonight is basically saying that you're always going to qualify. Well, when we get to the point where I define how you can increase your levy, you're going to find out that that may not actually allow you to fund all your services. So that part of this forecast will show you that there are pressure points out there that you're going to have to start to think about. Hopefully you'll be able to address them, and I'll talk about that more later. The next section is on the bond rating. When I believe Phil Costin was here after we sold the notes this year, he should have included in your packet the actual rating report. I had Caitlin make me a copy just in case there's some things that I need to take a look at, but there's some really good information there as far as there's like a scorecard in there that shows you how Moody's actually looked at each piece that's basically on this sheet in front of you. So really what they do is they break up the rating into a bunch of different categories. The first part is 30% of the rating, which is economy and base. And really this is a section that you can't actually do much about except, try to get some economic development here that might help your tax base. You can't really do anything about what a person earns. So wealth for a medium family income, it's not something you can do much with. As well as the full value per capita. So unfortunately, this is a part that hopefully your city actually, as you're going forward and you're having all the decisions you make, that maybe that those items will actually do what you want them to do and increase and make the city's value in the tax base be a bigger number and it'll reflect better with the rating agencies. The next section is finances, and really that is something that the person behind me has a lot to do with when she's helping you put together your budget. The fund balance is a big deal because, really it shows how healthy you are. They look at that, and there's certain benchmarks in the industries on what those should be, and we're going to talk about fund balance later as well. But then they also look at the 5-year trend. So when you're making decisions on things, showing that your fund balance is actually trending up a little bit every year is better than having it bounce all around, and that can hurt your rating as well. So I mean, there's certain things when you're budgeting that you can do that you can make sure that those trends stay in the right line. Cash balance, liquidity is a big deal for rating agencies. It kind of goes hand in hand with fund balance as well, but they want to make sure that you have enough cash to operate, and then they look at that on a 5-year trend as well. The next section is management, and really what they do is every Wisconsin municipality in the state of Wisconsin is rated an A or an A2 basically for institutional framework. And really what that means is the rules that you have to follow that the state has put in place. So I mean, it takes into consideration levy limits, a whole bunch of different things, TIF. It's all those things wrapped up into one, and they give you a pretty solid average rating for basically everybody in the state if you're rated. The other thing they look at is whether your operating revenues are at least the same as your expenditures, and if not, you might get dinged a little bit if you're not covering your revenue or your expenditures with your revenues. The last section is on debt and pensions, really the items that you control through your, what we do on an annual basis is the general obligation debt, compared to your full market value of the city, and also a ratio that the Moody's uses for debt to revenue. And really that's based on how much debt you have and how much value or revenue you have. And so those are calculations that come right out of your audit. The last two are actually things that Moody's does in the background. They don't take what we have in our footnotes for the financial statements, but they do take some numbers that they apply their own assumptions to, and then they come up with a number that doesn't have anything that even remotely looks like what the Wisconsin retirement gives us, and probably anything that we have in our financials. So that's something they do on their own. Okay. Just to make a point, because this slide had a kind of a shortened name for it. It said GO, but that's general obligation debt, and that's really the debt that we issue for our local general government type projects, our streets and our parks and things like that, as opposed to the revenue debt that maybe your utilities issue. Going on to the next page is more of the bond rating stuff that actually pertains to you. The city is rated a AA2, and that's right in the middle of the AA section, so that's very solid. That's a very good rating, and really, at this point in time, based on some of the things that Moody's sees, that's the best the city probably can do right now. And really, I think what I talked about before was that the economic factors are really one of the things that kind of holds you back. It really wants you to. They really want you to basically grow the resident wealth and income. Well, that's something you can't actually make a decision and do. It's something where the residents have to have a way to actually make more money. And the other thing that they said that could help the rating is what they call the decline in total leverage, and that means you wouldn't use as much debt. And really, I think with the way that the city is budgeting for some of its debt, how much we borrow on an annual basis, that's something that I think would decline, although when we did the CIP, we talked about some bigger projects out there. But that is not an abnormal comment for anybody in Wisconsin. With levy limits, they kind of leave us like a very few choices on how we can actually fund things. So that is not something you'd be surprised if you looked at somebody else that would be right in there as well. So you're pretty normal as far as how they look at the city for that. The things that they thought that they look good, that you have a strong financial position, you have a growing tax base. The thing about the leverage is the elevated fixed costs, which is something they look at hard, and the fact that you're constrained by the state imposed levy limits is one of the challenges as well. Let's go on to the slide 8. It's kind of a grid. There we go. So we wanted to make sure that you had a chance to take a look at some comparable communities. Staff helped us narrow this down to municipalities that were a little bit more like Sheboygan. And so you can see where we highlighted in green where you have a better comparison to some of these other bigger cities. So your rating's pretty good. You're at the top dog basically with Janesville. They're about the same in La Crosse. You have better statistics than many of these places. So, I think some of the things that we talked about with tax base, you see Janesville at a 7 million, a bigger tax base also looks better to rating agencies as well. So, for the most part, you're pretty strong compared to most of these communities that we compared to. So, that's a good sign. Then as far as why is a bond rating important? Well, I took your borrowing from the spring and tried to apply what would happen if you actually dropped to an A schedule. So if you were not a AA, you were an A. And, with the size borrowing that we did this year, it's really hard to take that split. But basically, it's about 10 to 15 basis points between a AA and an A. And really, all that really ended up doing is maybe saving you $7,000 in this case. But if we do bigger borrowings, it's going to be a bigger savings, and then it's really worth having that rating. So it's important that we maintain that. It keeps us from spending money on interest that we wouldn't necessarily do if we maintained that bond rating. Then going on, is there any questions on ratings? Because that was a fairly big section there.
Any questions so far? Alder Perella?
A very simple question about the Moody's rating. So how is the scale? I could check afterwards, but if you can tell me, for example, the AA3 is better than AA2.
Yes. Okay. So on a Moody's schedule, AAA is your best, and then AA1 is the next one, and then AA2 is the next one down from that. So you're 2 away from the top. But most of the AAA people have a rate or have a tax base that's probably, well, it's quite a bit bigger than Sheboygan is. So that economic thing is really what's holding you back as far as moving up maybe to a AA1. But your financials are good, and that keeps you at that AA2 without any question.
Thank you.
Yep. Any other question?
Alder Flicky-Paneski?
Yes, and just for the record, how far down the alphabet do you have to go before it's junk bonds?
Say that again.
Just for the record, how far down do you go in the alphabet before it's junk?
You would not want to be in the Bs, in the
Thank
double
you.
Bs. So
Thank you.
I think if you're a triple B, you're okay, but it's still kind of, I would not want to be below a AA or an A2 on the Moody's schedule. So it goes AA1, AA2, AA3, then A1, A2, A3, and A2 is where you basically land when you're not rated. So I would say you don't really want to be below an A2, but junk is in the Bs.
Thank you.
Yep. Any other questions? Okay. So let's go on to page 10. So this was the, basically we tried to do a forecast of where equalized values were going. And really, I think in the way that the market has been lately, it is really important that we try to keep these projections more in line with net new construction, because really net new construction is where you can spread new taxes to. Unfortunately, the other side of that coin is the fact that if your TIF districts are making all the net new construction, then they're not necessarily generating the tax base to spread your regular levy over. So, you know, they're doing some good for us, and we're closing some TIF districts. I think we extended one. I think we extended one that'll be closed next year, and then there's about 3 or 4 of them that are closed the year after. So, you know, eventually they do help us out, but in the meantime, you know, if we have a decent year of TIF and we're growing and we want that, obviously, sometimes we can end up taxing the regular resident, even though there was growth only in the TIF district. So we take advantage of that, you know, even though it's only 1.38%, it could be that was all in the TIF. So there is that possibility that we're taxing the regular taxpayer because of growth in the TIFs. But what we try to do is stay a little bit under that. So on this sheet, we show you where your total equalized value with the entire city, which would be everything including the TIFs, and then we also try to show you what we project the TID out to be, which right now are basically 1-for-1 with a TID in, and then the net new construction, which is the one that helps you increase your levy. On the levy limit worksheet, we have under what you've had and really under your 5-year average. So we tried to be a little bit conservative. That's one that, you know, obviously you have to watch how much that is and know that that's what you want your new value to basically cover some of those taxes. And as I said, as far as the TIFs, and I wasn't looking down at this page when I was talking about it, but 2023 closure, which will affect the 24 budget, was TID 15. So you can see we have a little better growth in the TID out number. And then the 2024, we basically have a little bit better number because I know that Phil talked about this in his presentation, but I think 6, 10, 12, 13, and 14 may close and affect the 25 budget, which is value year 24. So those are some things that you'll probably be considering this coming year. Okay. When the TIF guy talks behind me, I wonder if there's something that he wants to. Am I wrong? No. Okay. I just know he's the guy that does the TIF. I wanted to make sure I wasn't saying something wrong. I know. How do I know? The camera's not looking at him. On page 11 is basically how we start to go about fund or projecting out the operating fund. And so we're looking at the tax levy. In this case, for the city of Sheboygan, what we said is that we're going to do it based on net new construction. So really the only funds that are going to, in this projection, that are going to increase any is the library, and I believe it was the library and the general fund. That's correct. So we took the net new construction amount and we allowed those, in the model, we allowed those to grow by that net new construction. So the only problem is that when you, see, it says it differently that I'm saying it, but when we first started out, we actually were doing a projection that showed that we were going to balance the general fund. And by balance the general fund, that means it's a plug. It basically covers all the expenditures it takes you to operate. Well, we found that we thought it'd be better to show you what we really can raise taxes by and then show you how the fact that it might not cover everything we need to do. So that was one of the things that we made a decision on for projection purposes. Then as far as the rest of the revenues, There isn't a lot of ways to increase revenues in a municipality. There's other types of revenues that you can maybe add, but there really isn't a way to say, hey, we're going to grow this revenue by X. And so, I mean, unfortunately, we don't have a lot of choices when it comes to municipal revenues, and so we budgeted those flat because there really isn't any place to go and grow your revenues. Expenditures, basically, we worked with staff to kind of come up with some percentage increases on line items, mainly that are more like in nature, so like your supplies or your wages or your benefits or insurance and things like that. You'll see the schedule on the next page, and we use those to basically project out 5 years. There were certain items that we did have staff kind of look at that might have one-time blips in them, and we do have those projected in here, but after those one-time blip years, we went back to a forecast code. And then when we get down to the bottom, it's how is it affecting fund balance? We're going to talk a little bit more about fund balance on a future slide. So on page 12 is really the schedule that we use to forecast your expenditures. You can see they're fairly high. Hopefully they aren't this, hopefully these are representative of the 5 years and that we don't have 7 to 10% inflation for the entire 5 years. Hopefully they'll get that under control, but so we went with something that hopefully is going to be more representative over the 5 years. So you can see what we used here for commodities, which would be your supplies, your repair supplies and things like that. Your employee fringes are the things that are not driven by payroll. Down farther is wages, and basically we pull into wages. We increase those by not only the wages, but the FICA and the retirement system, things like that. And so we just have different categories we use to actually project. That kind of rolls into the next page, which is fairly small, and I think maybe it's a good thing that you have a paper copy in front of you so you can maybe magnify it a little bit. But as you can see on the top line, local property taxes, like I said, we are only growing that by net new construction, which I had in earlier as 1.25%. And so each year you can see it's not going up a lot. The rest of the revenues you can see are staying basically the same year after year, because we said we were going to keep that flat. And then the expenditures are going up by those 5% kind of numbers that were on that last page. So when you take a look at what the wage percentage was a little bit low in here, but if you take that and you average it out, and since payroll is probably 60% of your 60 to 70% of your budget, that's why that's not at 5%, but there's some fairly decent increases in here. And so if you're only increasing your levy by 1.25% and your expenditures are going up more like by 3 to 4 to 5%, obviously we're not going to keep pace. So the other thing that's in here is that in the CIP plan, we plan to use some fund balance amounts to fund some capital projects. And as we were going through here, we kind of were looking at the fund balance policy, and there was something that jumped out at us, and I'm going to get that in a second. I just want to kind of hit that next line where it says net change. So if our revenues aren't keeping pace with our expenditures, and we had planned transfers to capital pay for projects, you can see that we're going to be deficit spending every year, and it basically ends up wiping out our fund balance. That's something that, there's some things that you're going to be able to do about that, but you'll need to probably look at those a little bit more at budget time, and that's something I also have a little bit of a recommendation at the end that you can talk about. So the one thing that really changed from basically a week ago is Caitlin and I had a phone call that talked about fund balance, and while we were talking about fund balance, we noticed that it had a component to it called working capital that was supposed to be in addition to your normal 25% of your next year's expenditures. So when I read through the policy and found where the $4 million was supposed to be set aside for working capital, it really jumped that assigned line up from what we normally have it at. So what it ended up doing is it actually ended up dropping the unassigned fund balance policy. So second from the bottom green line is that number. We're supposed to have about 25%. At the end of '21 in the audit, we're good. We're still good in 2022 with the projected amounts there, but then it starts to fall off. And when the capital plan was done, it was with a thought that, that we had everything established in that unassigned line. And with that $4 million, it kind of pulls down that fund balance a lot faster. So with less tax levy and still having those capital transfers in that, obviously it's not set in stone, it makes it look like you go basically down to a 5% fund balance and you're out of compliance. So there's a couple things that just to talk about on that working capital line is that, the audit hasn't reflected that $4 million. Your fund balance policy that says 25% really does represent your working capital, and it's possible that that $4 million additional amount is something you could consider putting back into the unassigned and not having that because you already have a policy that states what your working capital number is going to be. So it's possible that you'd have that $4 million to be able to use towards your capital, but it's something that I think that staff will bring back to consider whether or not that's necessary, and you can make that decision. Okay, so that was a lot on operating. I kind of maybe stop there because that was quite a bit. Do you have some questions on that part? Because that had some significant items in it.
Any questions so far? Alder Flicky-Paneski?
Thank you. Let's go back to the assigned and the unassigned.
Yep.
And you talked about, we pulled out the $4 million to put into our capital investment program.
So when we did the projection up until about a week or so ago, where we really nailed down what the policy that you have is right now, that $4 million was sitting in unassigned. Basically, it's your rainy day fund. And so when we found that in the policy, and it hasn't been put into any kind of a document, hasn't been put into the audit as being something that's set aside, we moved that to a point where basically it's set aside for only that purpose. And so what it did is really, it shrunk the amount that, we'll talk about fund balance. And fund balance has a bunch of different categories. You do have a category called non-spendable on your audit. And really what that's made up mostly is your advances or your loans to the TIF districts, where the TIF districts did not have cash to be able to pay their own bills. So the general fund has basically loaned cash to the TIF. It's really, I think it's really, the biggest is like TIF 16, right? Yes. TIF 16 is probably the biggest part of that non-spendable portion. And so as the TIF districts basically get healthier, and that one starts to get enough value to pay off its obligations, that money will come back to the general fund, and actually it'll release cash that general fund can potentially use towards operations or capital in the future. Restricted, you really don't have much of, but that really would be things that you have set aside because of laws or things that, basically make that money can't be spent for anything. So impact fees is a big thing where you collect it and it can only be spent for specific things. Committed fund balance, really, if you sign a contract for construction on a road for next year before the end of the year, that money is committed to that road project. And so that's a line that would house that kind of an item. And then assigned fund balance is really where you have the ability to move money into a spot where it is supposed to be used for a specific purpose. But as you know, you can't hold a future council to those decisions necessarily. So that money actually can move back and forth between assigned and unassigned based on council action. And then as you can see on the unassigned line, it does say funds held as working capital. That's why that may be something that you could bring that $4 million back into unassigned, because unassigned is defined as working capital. The other thing that unassigned can be used for, and I think I'll wait and tell you more about that in a couple slides. There's a couple examples of what you can use that unassigned fund balance. So I'm going to go on from that unless there are questions on categories of fund balance. So the next slide basically shows the projection as to what happens to the fund balance based on that detailed number schedule that I showed you a couple back. It shows that we really shrink down our unassigned fund balance from the fact that we're transferring money out to capital. The Non-spendable stays about the same throughout the period. We don't have TIF 16 really paying back in the projection period. It does in the future based on the schedule that Phil Costin showed you earlier this year, but that's a line item that, it may shrink in the future or may, grow depending on how you're funding your TIF projects in the future if you develop new TIFs. Otherwise, I think the committed line or the assigned line, stays about the same. I think that's basically the $4 million plus a little bit in there. And really the thing that I think is important to talk about here is that we really want to protect this fund balance, especially the unassigned, because that's something that I talked about under the ratings that they want to make sure that you have enough to operate. And so that's something that we definitely want to make sure that we don't let this fund balance do what this projection is saying. So on the next page is where I talked about some of the things that you could use fund balance for. So if you have excess fund balance above your policy, there's things that you can use that for. Obviously, we talked about the working capital and the cash flow. That's normal usage. But sometimes fund balance, when you have excess, can be used for things like unexpected revenue shortfalls or cost overruns. You could use it for emergency expenses. It's possible, what you already do, you transfer money out to capital projects to make those purchases, so that excess fund balance is going there. Sometimes you can use it to pay off debt, maybe sick leave type stuff. And then one-time non-recurring expenditures, probably a good example of that is if you undergo a reassessment, that's a fairly large bill to pay for a reassessment. And so if you, some places do it annually, but if you do it every once in a while, that's something that maybe you need to have money set aside that you can use that for non-recurring stuff. So it's something that we want to make sure that emphasize that if you have excess fund balance, that it's a one-time revenue. You don't want to use it to cover your operations because operations are ongoing and you create a hole if you use fund balance for that. So the next fun subject that we always talk about in municipal budgeting is levy limits. The current levy limit is statute 660602, and basically all this law lets you do is increase your annual levy by what's called net new construction. And net new construction really is new construction less any demolition. So that number gets reported to by your assessor to the state, and the state converts that to a percentage, and that's like the 1.38% that you're able to increase your levy this year. So it's not a very big number. The one thing about levy limits you're going to find out probably fairly quickly is that they do not give you anything for inflation. So inflation is something that can definitely make your funding your fund balance and having your services stay the same can be a pretty disastrous thing. And it'd be nice to have some of the legislatures know that we're all over the place. We're seeing municipalities that are having a hard time funding their budgets this year, and we're just getting started. So I help a number of places, and it's going to be a tough year when you've got 7 to 10% increases in inflation, and you can only go up 1.38%. That's pretty rough. The other program that we'll talk about in a little bit called Expenditure Restraint at least has an inflationary component to it, and really this one should too. I think we've been spoiled with some really good economic years lately, but this is not that year, and so it's something that they need to consider, that there's times where we're going to need some help to pay for our services, to keep our employees from taking jobs where they can get more money, anything like that. So I think levy limits is in its thoughts are a good idea, but I think they're short-sighted and they don't take into account that we don't have a way to grow any other revenue. So as far as the levy limit worksheet itself, like I said, it takes what you levied last year, gives you that 1.38% of net new construction this year, and then you're able to add onto that amount how much you pay for general obligation, principal, and interest. That's pretty much the typical levy limit worksheet. There are other line items that get used by people, but a lot of the exceptions, in addition to that debt levy exception, are pretty strange. in the cases, the other ones I see is where maybe you didn't use all your net new construction, so there's a carry forward. Some places use that. You don't have that carry forward issue. Gosh, I'm trying to think if there's anything else that would be worthwhile even talking about. Some of these that are exceptions are things that there was special legislation for one particular municipality, and they probably could drop off because they're not really applicable to most places. So, there are A through U or A through T as far as exceptions, and there's probably 3 that you might use. Let's see, I already talked about the inflation part, and then let's go on to the next slide, and that kind of shows you where we've been with our net new construction over the last 4 years. 2019, you were able to increase your levy 68,000, and you can see from the rest of these. So this year, with your 1.382, that you can raise your levy for operating purposes by 362,000. So that's not a lot of money to operate a city your size. It's gonna be something that budget time that you're gonna have some decisions to make. On the next page is just kind of walking through how the levy limit worksheet goes. There's a section, basically lines 1 through 8 are all operating in nature. You have last year's levy, you've got maybe some TIF closures and some net new construction, and those are the ways that you can raise your levy. And so that's the only one that I didn't talk about earlier, is that you are going to have some TIF closures. It affects, I believe, the 23 budget, that you'll have a closure of one of the TIFs. And so there is a little bit of a jump from that. And let's see, maybe it comes on next year, Caitlin. Yeah, it must be the 24 budget, so it's not on this one. So it'll go on your 24 budget, and that means we got to correct the projection for you, so we'll do that. And then we'll have some that'll affect you in 25 as well for closures. So that's the other way that we can get the levy limit to go up, is by that TIF closure. So we have the operating levy plus, what we can get from net new construction, what we can get from TIFs closing, and that gets us basically down to a line that is how much you have available to do your operations. Then the next part, the other part that is also covered by levy, well, for you specifically, is your general fund, library, and transit, and your capital projects are subject to levy limits. And then that next section of the levy limit is the debt service, and that's not subject to levy limits, which means they call it being outside the levy limit. So whenever we have general obligation payments, we're allowed to put that as an adjustment and add it to our regular levy limit so we can make our debt payments. And so that's a standard adjustment for the city. The next page shows you your calculation. So we had a levy of 25.9 million last year. We're allowed to add what's called personal property aid to that amount. And that gives us basically the total amount that we had as amounts that we were going to levy for the last year. We take away from that how much we had on that adjustment line of $4 million, and we have what they call the baseline for doing your calculation of the net new construction or the TIF closures. So you can see we have a base number of about 21.8 million. You can see that 1.382% that we're allowed to go up, and that shows you that you had $301,000 that can go up. And I showed 362 before. That's interesting. So the levy is allowed to go up $301,000. The total levy that you'd be able to have this next year just for operating purposes is 22.1 million. They take away what they're going to give you in aid for personal property aid, and so what you'll actually show on your levy limit worksheet this year for operating purposes is about $22 million. Then if we put on the debt adjustment line the amount that we need for debt service, which is about $4.4 million, we then can have a maximum levy limit number with debt in it of 26.5 million. So that's really, as you can tell, we have not really gone up a whole lot from the 25.9 million from the year before. Okay, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you. Let's go back up to adjustment E, that 4 million? Is that the same 4 million we were talking about as unassigned and assigned?
No, it is
Okay.
not. So you have a bunch of debt issues that you've done over the years, like the one we did last winter. And those are the payments that we have to make of principal and interest on those old debt issues that we have for
Thank you.
general obligation debt.
Thank you.
Okay.
The net new construction of 1.382, how does that compare to other municipalities?
Well, I think what I saw in League of Wisconsin Municipalities is that between 1 and 2 is pretty standard this year. I did see somebody at almost 7%, but they had a lot of new building, and they were a smaller municipality, so 7% for a smaller municipality is different than if you had 7%. So a lot of places are between 1 and 2% this year.
So it is a trend this year compared to, I mean, is that something that you would reasonably justify with the financial environment and right now?
Well, I think in a lot of communities, it depends on just what you have going on for economic growth. So, I mean, if you don't have a lot going on at that time, that number, would obviously show that you don't have much, or you're just a bigger municipality and, 1.38% is a decent amount of growth, but it just doesn't compare to how big you are in total. So I don't know that I would say that. It really kind of depends on your size of your municipality and then what you have going on in town as far as new construction.
I was just wondering if this can be used as an indicator in relation to growth. So does that mean that we are growing less? Not just the construction-wise. We are growing less financially as a city, economically.
It definitely holds you back from growing financially, yes. Because you're not allowed to actually increase your levy to be able to pay for new services or your current services is what it's going to do.
I'm so sorry, I actually meant, can this be used as an indicator in relation to economic growth of the city in general, not as us, as the city administrator, but the city in general?
Yeah, I mean, it's...
So I just want to say a few comments. So I think I understand what you're saying from the economic front. What I would say is net new construction, I think year over year and previous, we didn't have a lot of big projects that were underway. So we had a lot of smaller projects that got underway. But in previous years, we've had a lot of apartment buildings that were, in the range of $20 to $30 million. And a lot of the growth that we've seen has happened in TIF districts, which, goes against us on our general fund expenditures. So, hopefully with the closing of these districts and continued growth and the projects that are on the horizon that, if the market holds itself and these projects start construction, hopefully we'll see, net new construction next year. But from a planning and economic development side of things, I would say it's been a little bit slower from the large project standpoint.
Thank you.
Is that anybody else? Okay. So then just from a graphical standpoint, the levy limit graph that we have here actually has another component on it too. When we did the projection, we actually were trying to figure out how we could actually cover more of our expenditures. And so you do see a black section on this that says that we exceeded our total maximum levy limit. There are ways to use basically debt paid by other funds, but it's something that you definitely don't do unless you're using it for one-time things. So I think, what we would want to direct your attention to basically is the blue and the red section, which is what we've been talking about, where that's your operating portion of the levy limit, and then that debt adjustment for what we cover with levy, what we pay levy dollars for general obligation debt payments. So that top of that red line is really the calculation that most, that you should calculate or you should focus in on, because those other ones are things that you start using using the levy limit to do one-time purchases, and there's ways to do that. And if you got to that point, there are things that we could talk about with that, so. Okay. So the next program is Expenditure Restraint. A lot of times when you're talking about one, it kind of makes you a little goofed up, because on Expenditure Restraint, it talks about how much you can raise your expenditures. Well, this year, inflation for the expenditure restraint form is actually like at 7%. Now, like I said before, you can't use inflation on the levy limit worksheet. So in most likelihood, most people aren't going to be able to use the whole expenditure restraint amount because they can't afford to raise their levy that high. So it's kind of goofy, but this one actually gives you some kind of inflationary increase. What this program does is it's supposed to keep a local government's expenditures in check. And so you're allowed a CPI value, which this year is about 7%, a little bit above, and last year was 3%. So you can tell there's a fairly big difference between last year and this year. And then they give you a percentage of your net new construction. So 60% of your net new construction gets added to that number. It ends up putting us somewhere around 8%, I think, probably somewhere in the 8%. So what they try to do is make you do a comparison of last year's expenditures to this year's expenditures, and if you don't go up more than that factor, then you qualify for a program that allows you to get more shared revenue. So it's a pot of money. It's been about the same amount. I want to say it's $54 million that they've been doling out since 2004, I think. The more people that qualify, the more reduced your payment is, because the more people that are in that pool are still dividing up the same amount of dollars. And so, I think it's a decent chunk here, isn't it, though?
It's not bad yet.
So that's a program that basically is something that starts with the top line. It has basically the general fund expenditures and any fund where you transfer taxes out to it. And basically they let you take away from that the debt service, and that gives you your base amount. There are some exceptions as well, and these are fairly rare as well. Let's see, what was the one that I think I saw? So there was something where if you had an emergency declaration and some of the things that you spent money on weren't reimbursed through grants, that's something that you could subtract off. So there's a bunch of weird ones that I don't think will apply to the city, but that's the kind of thing that can also reduce how much that line is to give you a different base to compare to the prior year, and then show whether or not you qualify. And I think Caitlin gave me one that she did here, and it's this point, it's more like 4.69%, but you haven't started your budget process, so I'm guessing that'll change a little. So that's that program. Any questions on expenditure restraint? They do have basically a example of the worksheet for the 5 years that we were projecting out. That first column actually now is, instead of being 3% in the top part where the yellow is 7.7% for CPI. But if the city is going to increase its levy by what looks like about 8.5%, you're going to have to be able to cover that with the revenues. Have we talked about? You really don't have that kind of a raise in the tax levy because of the levy limits, so you may not be able to take advantage of the full amount. So we'll see how it goes through the budget process. Then on page 25 is basically that overall look of everything that we've talked about with you over the year. The operating amount is how much the operating levy would be if it goes up by net new construction that we used as an assumption. The same with the library. It's also going up by that net new construction amount. We have the levy in here and held that flat for basically the rest of the funds that have taxes, which is capital projects and the transit. And then as far as what we showed you for capital, where we were modeling out the existing debt payments for general obligation debt, plus the new ones that we were saying we were going to do, we're only showing you 5 years here, but we did the 10-year CIP, if you remember. Adding those together basically gets you a tax rate over on the right, where we're starting at the 23 with $7.67. We go up a little bit. I think that's mostly because some of the new projects, we go up to about 8.2%. And then you see in 2025, we have that TIF closure that basically brings the tax rate down because those TIFs end up being quite a bit of value coming back to the tax roll. And then it kind of just keeps going along as far as that increase in the tax rate based on, the net new construction and the debt that's on here too. I think the debt ends up holding steady over the years, so that ends up being a no increase on that, so mostly it's in the operating. So the graphs basically show you that, we're going to have increases in tax dollars, but we're trying to hold that tax rate about as smooth as we can. And I think you can see from here that there's just a little bit of creep in the tax rate on that based on the numbers that are above, but that kind of shows you what we're really trying to get to, if we can, is really getting one flat tax rate that allows you to operate your operations as well as pay for your projects. Any questions on that? So as far as what might change the operating projection that we just showed you is, obviously increasing your growth allows you to potentially levy more taxes to pay for your services or your projects. Inflation obviously can have a negative effect, as we talked about quite a bit today. As far as employees, if you want to retain them, that it's possible that some of your payroll is going to affect how much your wage lines look like. Timing of TID closures are important because those sometimes can help us do either more projects or help us fund things a little bit better. And like I said, there's a couple closures that are coming up in the 24 budget and the 25 budget. If the state would do it, which I don't think I've seen a whole lot of increases, if for some reason there was some increased state funding, now that's something that you don't see very much anymore, so that's not probably likely. Maybe considering alternative revenue methods, and I have a slide that will talk a little bit more about that coming up. And then, if you need to increase your maintenance of your infrastructure, if you have infrastructure that is something that's around that maybe you need to do more maintenance on, that could also affect how much it costs to actually operate your services. So general comments from what we saw is, the current use of fund balance to fund capital projects is probably not sustainable. I think the one thing is if you consider your fund balance policy and revisit that, there might be some more. There's some fairly big projects, but the one thing when you're looking at that and doing your budget, you want to make sure you're staying within your policy. So that's really going to be your guideline, is staying above that policy and not sending money away that you might need. As far as the fund balance policy, not only consider changing the fund balance policy with the working capital, but also if you do have excess funds, how can you use it? And so I don't think that your fund balance policy says that you can send it for one-time purchases of capital or one-time, items in the general fund, but maybe have something that defines what that excess funds can be used for. The other thing is the expenditure restraint program right now, the revenue is actually budgeted in the general fund. I'm reading the line and it didn't make sense to me at first. And really, if there's a way for us to move that to the capital fund, that would eliminate maybe a future hole in the general fund. And since you have levy in the capital projects fund, it's really a matter of moving the levy to the general fund and that revenue source to the capital fund. And that way, if you don't qualify, it isn't a hole in the general fund. It's in a fund that you could fund through, a long-term borrowing or some other funding source that maybe come up like a grant. So it basically keeps your general fund from having a potential future hole. Promoting economic development, we've talked about that a little bit. I think one of the things that is important to know is that in today's world of developers, that economic gaps are becoming bigger, and there's more need by some of those developers to have maybe TIF incentives. And so I think that from a standpoint of like pay-as-you-go type of arrangements with developers, that maybe that's a way you can have a relationship with them without putting the risk on the city for putting in infrastructure and those kinds of things. It's a way to put the risk more on the developer, and so those incentives would, obviously help. But that's one thing you'll probably experience is that the developer gaps are a little bit bigger now than they were. And then, these are pretty standard, but annually review your policies to make sure they still make sense and they fit. It's something that we always did as a annual item for the budget at the place that I worked, and so that was something I always started with a meeting. We went over policies and decided whether or not they needed to change or whether they still fit. And then as city administrators, strategic planning vision says, that you'll continue to look at long-range planning and see where those pressures are and see how you can adapt to those and try to address those ahead of time. And just a couple things, as long as we were talking about levy limits, and I'm almost done. These are kind of things that when you get to the point where you're starting to really have problems with meeting levy limits, these are it's basically the low-hanging fruit to the worst case scenario as far as these are going. But you're going to go through the process this year, and inflation is going to affect where you're at. Your wage study might affect where you're at, and so you're going to go through the annual budget process and see if there's any way to fund all of what you have in your process, and hopefully you're going to find a way to do that and move some things around, or maybe there's things that can be eliminated or funded somehow through, whether there's capital that's in the general fund that could move, and I believe there isn't much left in there, but if there's things like contingencies and things like that, those are things that you can kind of go after first that are low-hanging fruit in the general fund, and hopefully your annual budget process will call some of those out. The next step when things, your budget process aren't really getting at everything is taking a look at alternative revenues. The wheel tax is one that's been used by more and more communities, like, the Madisons, the Milwaukees, and smaller entities as well have been taking this on. I know even Waterloo, Wisconsin has a wheel tax. So,
We
there's.
have a wheel tax?
You do? Yeah. Didn't you guys review my report?
No, to increase. We have.
Well, you could increase your wheel tax, but do we know how you compare to other communities? I apologize.
Okay.
Staff left me hanging out to dry. No, just kidding. You could increase your wheel tax depending, you might probably want to see what your neighbors or whatever else has for percentages and see how you compare to those. There's something called a street light. They call it a street light utility, but it's not. Really what it is a way for the general fund to recoup the electric bill that the general fund pays for streetlights. And so that's something that I've seen more and more. I think the one community that really got that one rolling about 10, 15 years ago is Rice Lake. They did quite an extensive study of it. They got an attorney involved that was pretty high. Anita Galucci, I think her name was, that signed off on it. And because the big problem, especially with transportation utilities, is it a tax or not? And she demonstrated that it was not. And so streetlight user fee or streetlight recoup fees are something that are actually legitimate and have been through the court. And so really what it is you come up with a methodology for determining what your unit is. When people want to do a simple way, they use a house being one unit, and then after you get bigger than a fourplex, then it's 2 units, and businesses are 2 units. Now Rice Lake is much more involved, where they have square footages of curbs where businesses, maybe you're an economic corridor for people to come to. They were trying to find a way to actually put the tax on places that would have outside people coming to it as well. So there's complex, and that's the one that the attorney really signed off on, and then there's a simpler way. So there's ways to do that, and I don't know what your electric bill here is, but I'm guessing it's probably fairly substantial. So if you were desperate, that may be a place to turn. And then once we get the courts to kind of sign off on whether transportation utilities are taxes or not, that's a way that people have been trying to find ways to find money to pay for street maintenance and street construction as well. There's a couple that got it in place, and then Pewaukee, I believe, is the one that got sued, and I think that's why we're at a standstill on that. So that's a possibility. We'll see what happens in the courts. Then the next step in the getting desperate stage is actually looking at your services and see what you actually have for services and what are funded by the tax levy. And then, really maybe surveys of your residents to see what's a priority. And then maybe, the worst, you really don't want to do this, but maybe you find a way that you're cutting some of those services so that you can afford to do your business. And then the ultimate is the levy limit referendum, and those have actually been growing and growing each year because there's a lot of places that can't find a revenue to do their services, and their residents are saying we can't live without this stuff, and so they go to referendum, and really the ones that the type of services they're hanging their hats on for these are public safety and public works, the things that are really right in your residents' faces, whether it's police or fire or just the shape of your road. So it's something that it's not a fun thing to do, but there are definitely a lot of places that are moving towards that more and more. So it's it didn't used to be something that got passed very easily, but they are starting to be passed now. So, okay, I've spoke quite a bit. So if you have any questions, I'm available for anything that you might have.
Any questions? All right. Administrator Wolf?
Thank you, Mayor. Dave, I just want to thank, yourself and Ehlers and all the hard work. I know that there are hundreds, if not, over hundreds of hours that went into this and the changes and the modeling and things like that. I don't know if everybody understands the complexity of the information that we talked about in the different models, trying to figure out where are we going to be, where are we today, and where are we going to be in the next few years. So again, thank you for all your hard work.
Thank you.
Cool. All right. Thanks, David. All right. For the sake of time, we'll skip mayor's announcements tonight. Next, we have the consent agenda from items 10 through 23. Alder Feldy.
Thank you, Mayor. I move to receive and file all ROs, receive all RCs, and adopt all resolutions and ordinances.
Is there, and there's a second. Any discussion on any items in the consent agenda? Seeing none, this is a roll call. Alder Flicky-Paneski?
Thank you. Having just come off of budgeting and capital improvements, item 18 was regarding transit buses, and they're going to replace 6 of them, but I'm wondering how many we have now. These were for handicap transportation, and it seems to me we're adding to the fleet.
Director Pelchak, I saw you buzzed in first.
That question was asked at the Finance and Personnel meeting, and I believe it's 10.
Do you remember how many they had previously?
I believe they had a total of 10, and they replaced one last year, and they're replacing another 5 this year, so there would be, with CARES Act dollars, they paid for 1 last year, and then with these funding sources, they're replacing 5 of them for a total of 6, and there'll be 4 that weren't replaced, but those were newer.
Thank you.
All right. Alder Feldy?
Chad, can you tell me, is that out of a funded, something that was funded by the state, those buses, or is that out of the city's budget?
All right. That is actually going to be Director Krieger.
Thank you. The 5 buses, well, actually 6 buses, are going to be purchased with the CARES Act funding that was strictly dedicated by the Federal Transit Administration to fund these types of projects.
That's all. Thank you.
A different item, Alder Flicky-Paneski?
Different item.
All right. State the number.
Item number 20, and we're buying 4 SUVs and 1 van for the police department. And I thought we had a lease program that took care of, maybe not the van, but the SUVs.
Chief Domagowski, do you want to take that one, or?
None of our vehicles are leased. And so the vehicles that that are on here are in our 2023 capital plan that was approved, and we're ordering them now because now is the only time frame that we can order them. And so if we don't order them now, we won't get them in 2023. So our 2022 vehicles that we ordered last year in October, we just finally got the last one on Monday.
Thank you.
Administrator Wolf, do you want to add some more?
Yeah, just to add a little bit of clarity for the council, the fleet program that we have through Enterprise, it does not address any of the police department vehicles, mainly because of the number of miles and the wear and tear that they put on those vehicles within the 4 to 5 years that they rotate or less.
All right. Alder Flicky-Pineski.
Thank you. This was all about money. And this one is still police department. I happened to go to the shooting range for my
Are you referring, Alder Flicky-Pineski, on a number on the consent agenda?
number 21,
21.
lead remediation
All right.
on the shooting range next to our water treatment facility on the south side. I was at a shooting range on the north side. So my question is, do we have 2 shooting ranges? And once you remediate it, are we going to put the shooting range back there? And since it's also adjacent to the public utility that's going to be closed down and they're going to have to remediate the land anyway, do we need to do this now and are we going to replace it?
Administrator Wolf?
Alder Filicky-Pineski, the shooting range that you're referencing is a private entity that the police department uses. It is not owned by the city of Sheboygan.
And we pay them rent to use the utility? I mean, to use it?
I'm
And
not
can we
aware that
not
we
keep
actually
doing
pay
that?
them. It's more of a public service that they allow us to use it.
Yeah, you're talking about 2 different places. So
Okay, yes.
this is by the wastewater treatment plant.
Right.
We've used it for a very long time. I don't know how long, but it's never been remediated, so it needs to be remediated. And as part of that, we're rebuilding it so that we can continue to use it. The one that they're doing the current in-service training on now is a private entity who is allowing us to use their range for this 4 weeks of training that we're doing.
Thank you.
Any other discussion on the consent agenda? All right, this is a roll call vote. We will see if Municode works.
One person can get it.
All right, only Alder Ramey can get in, so she knows how to.
All right. Alderperson Ackley. Alderperson Decker.
Aye.
Alderperson Feldy. Alderperson Flicky-Pineski. Alderperson Heidemann. Alderperson Mitchell. Alderperson Perella. Alderperson Rust. Alderperson Salazar. 10 ayes.
All right, the consent agenda is approved. Next, reports of officers, item number 24, RO number 662223 by the City Plan Commission, to whom was referred General Ordinance number 102223 by Alderperson Heidemann, annexing territory owned by the City of Sheboygan to the City of Sheboygan, and recommends adopting the ordinance. Alder Heidemann?
I move that the, receive the RO and adopt the resolution.
Second. Motion and second. Any discussion on this item?
Okay, this is the annexation?
Yep. Alder Heidemann?
This is an annexation of the Gartman Farm. It's 194 acres. And it'll probably make the 10th district the largest district in the city. Thank you.
Not that we're counting, right? Additional comments on this item? I do have some comments that I'd like to add, just regarding this item. because this is going to be a lot of discussion as we move forward in the city. Overall, I'm very in favor of this annexation and helping our city grow. However, for the long term, I am against zoning this as suburban residential or SR5 for the long term. SR5 is our most restrictive zoning classification for our city. It does not allow for us to be creative and meet the needs for Sheboygan, for our housing needs that was outlined in the housing study. Sheboygan has desperately been needing workforce housing that many of our business leaders have been asking for and desperately been needing. Developing a sprawled out subdivision does not help the city meet our long-term goals and adds extra cost and burden to cities as well. So this is a great opportunity for the community as we move forward for this annexation. I just want us to make sure that we move forward in a positive way and we do it right. So just some comments on that one. Any additional comments on item number 24? All right, seeing none, this is a roll call vote as well.
Alderperson Ackley? Alderperson Decker?
Aye.
Alderperson Feldy? Alderperson Flicky-Peneski? Alderperson Heidemann? Alderperson Mitchell? Alderperson Perella? Alderperson Ramey? Alderperson Rust? Alderperson Salazar? 10 ayes.
All right, item number 24 is approved. Item 25 and 26 will be referred to the Finance Personnel Committee. Item number 27, resolution number 662223 by Alderpersons Feldy and Flicky-Peneski, authorizing the appropriate city officials to execute liability waiver documents in support of tourism promotion videography activities that have been taken place on city-owned property or managed property. Alder Feldy,
I ask to suspend the rules.
any objection to suspension? Seeing none, please proceed with the motion.
I move to adopt the resolution.
Second.
There's been a motion and second. Any discussion on this item? Seeing none, this is a roll call vote.
Alderperson Ackley?
Aye.
Alderperson Decker?
Aye.
Alderperson Feldy?
Aye.
Alderperson Flicky-Peneski?
Aye.
Alderperson Heidemann? Alderperson Mitchell? Alderperson Perella? Alderperson Ramey? Alderperson Rust? Alderperson Salazar? 10 ayes.
All right, that item is approved. Next, resolution number 732223 by Alderpersons Decker and Rust, authorizing a contract with Wallace Tree and Landscape for the removal of the remaining city trees and stumps that were damaged during the June 15, 2022 windstorm. Alder Decker.
Thank you, Mayor. I request to suspend the rules.
Any objection to suspension? Seeing none, please proceed with the motion.
I make a motion to adopt the resolution.
Second.
There's been a motion and second. Any discussion on this item? Seeing none. Roll call vote again.
Alderperson Ackley? Alderperson Decker?
Aye.
Alderperson Feldy? Alderperson Flicky-Peneski? Alderperson Heidemann? Alderperson Mitchell?
Aye.
Alderperson Perella? Alderperson Ramey? Alderperson Rust? Alderperson Salazar? 10 ayes.
All right, item 28 is approved. Next, we have item number 29, resolution 722223 by Alderpersons Mitchell and Flicky-Peneski, authorizing the IT director to execute all necessary documents to enter into further contract with Dark Trace Holding Limited related to cybersecurity. Alder Mitchell?
Thank you, Mayor. I move to suspend the rules.
Any objection? Seeing none, please proceed.
Move to adopt the resolution.
Motion second. Any discussion? Seeing none, roll call vote.
Alderperson Ackley? Alderperson Decker? Alderperson Feldy? Alderperson Flicky-Peneski? Alderperson Heidemann? Alderperson Mitchell?
Aye.
Alderperson Perella? Alderperson Ramey? Alderperson Rust? Alderperson Salazar? 10 ayes.
All right, that item is approved. Items 30 through 33 will be referred to the respective committees. Next is item number 34 under reports of committees, RC number 992223 by the Finance and Personnel Committee, to whom was referred resolution 662223 by Alderpersons Mitchell and Flicky-Peneski, authorizing a budget adjustment and appropriation in the 2022 budget regarding the implementation of the updated pay scale for non-represented employees. Alder Mitchell?
Thank you, Mayor. I move to receive the RC and adopt the resolution.
There's been a motion second. Any discussion on this item? Alder Decker?
I just wanted to make a comment about the amount of money that is going into the library on this study. I know that the there was a lot of, complaints coming from there about some of the things that we're going through. And one of the things that I look at is that this is a regional entity. It's the city of Sheboygan is not the only one that gets the usage of it. The town of Wilson, town of Sheboygan, I'm not sure who else. I have to check with the library themselves, but they also get it, and they're not paying anything for this. This is all going to come out of the city of Sheboygan's coffers. And I think that we have to look at this as something that's going to come out of everyone's coffers, not just ours.
All right, thanks, Alder Decker. Any other discussion? All right, seeing none, then this is a roll call vote. Will the clerk please call the roll?
Alderperson Ackley. Aye. Alderperson Decker.
Aye.
Alderperson Feldy. Aye. Alderperson Palicki-Pineski. Alderperson Heidemann.
Aye.
Alderperson Mitchell.
Aye.
Alderperson Perrella. Aye. Alderperson Ramey.
Aye.
Alderperson Rust. Aye. Alderperson Salazar. 10 ayes.
All right, that item is approved. We've exhausted the agenda. Alder Felding.
I move to adjourn.
Second.
There's been a motion second. All those in favor of adjourning, please state aye.
Aye.
We're adjourned at 7:20. Sorry.
Sorry.
The council meeting will recess for 5 minutes. We'll do that downstairs at 106.